Hello, everyone. I want to take a few minutes today to talk about persuasive message elements or factors of persuasive messages that make them more or less persuasive, basically, from Chapter 9 in your textbook. I'm not going to add a lot of information that's supplemental today, and by that I mean much of what I'm going to say it can actually be found in Chapter 9 of your textbook, but I will elaborate on a few things and add a couple of pieces of extra information here and there. I want to first talk about message structure, or how you put together your persuasive message. Much of what I am going to talk about today will have a practical focus. I'm going to be focused on things that you could do as the source of a persuasive message to make yourself more persuasive. One of the things that's actually not discussed in your textbook that's fairly important here is the way in which you organize or order the main points of your persuasive message. And you probably learned this if you ever had a basic public speaking course. In pretty much any speech or any persuasive message that you would deliver, you'll have more than one main point that you want to make. So I might be trying to persuade a group of adolescents not to smoke, and one of my main points might be because smoking can cause lung cancer or otherwise damage your health, but I probably have some other points too, like smoking can also negatively impact your physical appearance. There may be some other points that I want to add. And so you need to think about how you want to order the main points or the main arguments in your persuasive message. There is some research with this, not surprisingly, which suggests that really you should, if you can, both start and end with your strongest arguments, your strongest points. So any points that you have that you think aren't that compelling, aren't that strong, maybe don't have a lot of statistics to back them up, bury those in the middle. There's research even from the instructional realm that suggests that people tend to forget what comes in the middle of a message. We only have so much capacity to cognitively process. We can't really remember everything that we hear all that well. And so we tend to focus or remember best what we hear first and what we hear last. This is somewhat true for studying as well. We recommend that students don't sit down and have, say, a 6-hour study marathon, because if it's a straight 6-hour marathon, you only have one start point and one end point, and there are a lot of hours in the middle there. We suggest breaking those up into 6 different hour-long periods with breaks in between, because you get more start and end points that way, and you're more likely to remember the things that you're reading or studying or hearing in terms of a persuasive message. This is partly due to the primacy-recency effect, which is an effect that has been longstanding in psychology, that basically suggests that what comes first or what comes last is paid the most attention to. And there's been a little bit of argument. Well, is it what comes first or what comes last? Which is it? There's evidence that supports both of those. There's a little bit more of a primacy effect if you forced me to choose between the two, but the recency effect is pretty strong as well, and it works with your persuasive arguments. We've also done a good bit of research with the one-sided versus two-sided messages. And what we know from this is it is rarely a good idea to deliver a persuasive message that only has arguments supporting your points or whatever it is you want your audience to do. So it's not just a two-sided argument. It's not just my argument in support of my position and the opposition's argument. It also requires successful refutation of the oppositional argument in order to be successful. If you can do that, though, a two-sided message will have more success by and large than a one-sided message will. And here's a lot of the reason for that. Two-sided messages tend to increase the source's credibility, or at least your perception of the source's credibility. It makes them appear as if they're more honest, and it makes them appear as if they're more fair and more unbiased. And those are important things to perceive in a persuasive source. If targets feel like the source of a persuasive message has too much to gain from their persuasive message, then they have a tendency not to want to accept what that source is saying. So two-sided arguments can really work in your favor. It's also important, as your book notes, to provide a conclusion, draw a conclusion for your audience. It's not enough to just state all these facts and hope that they'll come to the right, I am air quoting that, conclusion on their own. You have to hit it home for them. You have to make that conclusion for them. So make sure that you do that. Leave them with that. Again, that will contribute to your recency effect too. That's one of the key things that they should remember from your persuasive message. The message content information is certainly every bit as important as the way you organize your main points or whether you deliver a or two-sided message. I mean, what is the content of the message that might actually help you achieve persuasion or even compliance gaining? And your book talks about a couple of things here. They talk about a narrative approach, they talk about a framing approach. Those are good. I'm going to focus here on evidence. For me, evidence is the most compelling thing when it comes to the content of a persuasive message. This is a definition of evidence. It's provided in your textbook as well. These are usually statements of fact of some sort. So factual statements that don't come from you. These didn't originate with you. They originated with some third party. And they could be also opinions of persons other than the speaker or other than the source of the persuasive message, like an eyewitness or a testimonial, something like that. We see this in commercials all the time, right? If you can get a celebrity spokesperson to advocate for your product or your position, whatever it is, this is a source of evidence. It can also serve as a peripheral cue if you're thinking LM, but it can serve as some sort of evidence here. We offer those in support of our claims if we're the source of a message. For some targets, evidence in a persuasive message is going to be really important. Evidence relies on logos. Logos is not something I've talked about much before. Aristotle first noted three basic components of persuasion, the persuasive process: ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is basically credibility, and it has to do with the credibility of the speaker or the source of the persuasive message. If the source has credibility, that's a good thing. It won't guarantee you persuasion or compliance gaining, but it certainly helps. There's rarely an instance in which it would work against you. So to me, ethos or credibility is always important. Sometimes, though, it's a toss-up between whether logos or pathos is more important to include in your persuasive message. Evidence relies on logos. Logos is the use of logic, the use of reason, the use of proof, lots of times the use of statistics in order to make your point, to convince your audience, to give them evidence. This is the right thing, or this is the right way to feel. This is the right vote to cast. Evidence is important there. Logos is important there. Persuasive message content like narratives, which tell a story basically, lots of times from beginning to end, they use pathos, not logos. Not logos, yes, to achieve persuasion. Pathos calls on people's emotions. It calls on their values, and storytelling is a really good way to do that. We see this lots of times in persuasive messages too. I see ads on television about dogs who were abused or abandoned at birth. Those are pathetic appeals. They're emotional appeals. They're not giving me evidence or statistics or logic. They're trying to play on my emotions because they think playing on my emotions might encourage me to do whatever it is they're trying to get me to do, to donate to their animal shelter, whatever it is. Pathos and logos don't have to be sort of mutually exclusive, but you tend to see persuasive messages that focus on one or the other. And lots of times, whether or not that's successful will depend on the target, your audience. Audiences who are more educated, audiences who are higher in need for cognition, audiences who are higher in involvement with the topic, pathos, those emotional appeals are not going to work all that well for them. They are going to rely a whole lot more on logos. On the other hand, if you have targets who are very emotionally involved with the issue, it is an emotional issue for them. They're not really that high in need for cognition. They don't necessarily want to think a lot. Sometimes individuals with less education, pathos appeals can work better with those individuals even than the really strong proof or logic or facts can. So you really need to know who you're dealing with. But evidence that relies on logos, the logic and reason and proof, can work. There have been many meta-analyses, your book talks about a few of these, on the use of evidence in persuasion and, how effective is it? Are people really paying attention? Firstly, of course, your evidence needs to be good. If it's weak evidence and you've got a room full of high need for cognition people who are educated and really involved with the issue, then you've shot yourself in the foot. Your weak evidence is certainly not going to convince them. You would have been better off with a pathos appeal. But assuming your evidence is strong, assuming your evidence is good, it's compelling, we see a couple of interactions. First, evidence interacts with source credibility. If the speaker, the source of the persuasive message, is seen as credible, then evidence, good, strong evidence, is especially persuasive. So that 1-2 combo of good evidence and high credibility really works to get persuasion. We also see some interesting findings with the prior familiarity with the evidence. A lot of things that or something that happens a lot with persuasive messages, the non-smoking messages or don't drink and drive messages, don't text and drive. People hear them over and over and over, and they've already heard all of the evidence that you plan to present. If that's true, even if the evidence is good, it's likely not to be all that compelling for your audience because they've already heard that evidence. And if they were going to be persuaded, they probably already would have been persuaded by it. So James McCroskey was one of the first to argue we really, if you can get novel evidence, new evidence that this target audience has not heard, and that evidence is good, it's compelling, and that evidence seems plausible to them. It seems like, yeah, okay, that's a possibility. That's a viable possibility. Then you are going to have much more success with that evidence than you will old, tired arguments that people have already heard. It's also true that evidence interacts with the delivery effectiveness of the source of a persuasive message. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in I think the second to last slide, the next slide, I think that I'm going to talk to you about today. It is important that the source be a good speaker. Bottom line. Will that sell your persuasive effort? No, but it's one of the many factors that plays into it. Good evidence delivered by a poor speaker who just is not a good speaker, who engages in a lot of the things that we tell you not to do if you've ever had a basic public speaking class. They don't make good eye contact with the audience. Maybe they have a negative look on their face. They're stiff. They don't move around. Their speech doesn't seem extemporaneous. They're standing behind a podium and they're tied to that podium as if they're terrified to move out from behind it. All of those are delivery flaws that will significantly detract from your evidence, even if you have really good evidence. So what you want, again, is strong evidence, but get a source who can deliver it really well. That will work in your favor. Just to go back, a couple points. As I said, your book also talks about narratives in terms of message content and framing in terms of message content. Narratives, again, is a pathos approach, whereas evidence is a logos approach. And the framing is interesting in and of itself. I certainly suggest reading that. You should read that, but I'm not going to get into it here. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about that message delivery. There are so many things that matter here. And if you've never had the opportunity to take a basic public speaking class, I would, if you were my undergraduates, I would tell you you should. I guess at this point it's not really possible, but you really learn a lot there that can help you in a whole lot of different aspects in your life. And some of these are going to seem maybe a little random to you. Rate of speech, how quickly the speaker, the source of this persuasive message is speaking, is delivering the persuasive message, matters. Again, it's probably not going to be a deal breaker, but it can contribute to your successfulness as a persuader. And what we found is that speakers who actually speak a little bit more quickly than is the norm are often perceived as more credible, as more knowledgeable, as knowing what they are talking about versus someone who speaks really slowly. There is this long-standing sort of stereotype or assumption that people who speak really slowly maybe are not all that intelligent. Again, this is an assumption. It's certainly not based in truth or reality. I've struggled my whole life with my Southern accent because there are implications of that too, right? Connotations of that, let's say that. I don't speak slowly as some Southerners do. I tend to speak really, really quickly, and I don't do that on purpose. It's just who I am. But that can contribute to perceptions that I know what I'm talking about. I know it so well that I don't have to stop or pause or search for my words. It just flows. So how quickly are we talking about? Well, it's hard to sort of pin down what's the norm for average words per minute, basically. You can find different statistics. At the higher end of the average is about 150 to 160 words per minute. That's the higher end. That's the higher end. So if you are about in that range, about 160 words per minute or maybe a little above, you should get the rate of speech effect that we see here. Again, this is not going to sell it for you. If you're not credible in other ways, speaking quickly is not going to convince an audience that you're credible. But it is one of the things that can help, assuming all other things are in place, assuming you have a good argument, assuming they do see you as credible. Maybe you have some expertise or something like that. Now, there is a ceiling effect for this lots of times. Repetition. When I talked about repetition in an earlier lecture, I said there's a ceiling effect. You can do too much repetition. You can speak too quickly, too. And if you've got a group of people who really want to think about what you're saying, speaking really quickly, speeding through your arguments is not going to allow them to do that. And so speaking too quickly won't necessarily work in your favor. There is that ceiling effect. We don't know exactly where it is, unfortunately, but there is such a thing as speaking too quickly. If you've got good arguments, you want to give your audience time to think about them because they're good. You think they'll be convinced if they just take the time to listen. Powerless speech is certainly something that you want to stay away from because, in general, powerless speech, whether you're delivering a persuasive message or you're on a job interview or you're just at a meeting at work, this detracts from your credibility and perceptions, at least, of your expertise. Your book gives a few of these. I think intensifiers is maybe the only one here that's not listed in your book. You'll see these go by different names sometimes too. Intensifiers are adverbs such as very and really to describe something. Like dinner last night was good. You could say that, or you could use a verbal intensifier and say dinner last night was so good or really good. People use that in an attempt to make what they're saying stronger. But the odd thing is, I guess, or the unexpected or non-intuitive thing there is our research shows an opposite effect. It doesn't increase the strength of your statement. It mitigates your statement. It works against those perceptions. It sort of weakens your statement. I don't buy much into gender differences or sex differences, so you'll never hear me talk about them a lot, but I am going to talk about them a couple times here because there's so much consistent research that I just feel like I have to. Classically, historically, intensifiers have been associated with a more feminine style of speech, and that is because females are much more likely to use intensifiers than males are. That's just how it is, just what our research shows us. Females have traditionally, historically, classically, stereotypically, however you want to look at it, been in the lower power position. So any speech that's associated with them, like verbal intensifiers, has been associated with a less powerful form of speech. So these are good things to stay away from in a persuasive message. Again, particularly for women, but for persuasive sources, generally speaking. It's also not a good idea to use qualifiers or disclaimers. These ask the listener to make allowances or show understanding for your shortcomings. These basically seem like you don't know what you're talking about and you're sort of asking your audience to cut you a break because you don't know what you're talking about. I could be wrong, but I don't know a lot about this. I'm no expert. Why would you say those things? If you're the source of a persuasive message, you probably should know those things. And letting your audience know that you don't know those things is a real credibility killer. So qualifiers and disclaimers, not a good idea as a persuasive message source, not a good idea on a job interview, not a good idea in a lot of context. Hedges reduce the strength of what you're saying, I guess, maybe, sort of, kind of. Those certainly work against the strength of a statement, much like intensifiers do. The difference with hedges is you probably know when it's coming out of your mouth that it's working against the strength of that statement. Hesitations communicate a lack of certainty or high level of uncertainty. These are what we would call in public speaking verbal fillers or filled, F-I-L-L-E-D, pauses. Like, they suggest that you don't really know what you're talking about. This works with the rate of speech thing too. People who speak a little bit more quickly have a tendency to use fewer hesitations. And both of those things together contribute to the increased credibility perceptions. Finally, tag questions are a form of powerless speech. This is tagging a question that's really unnecessary onto the end of a declarative statement. What would otherwise just be a statement? That was fun, don't you think? That was a great movie, wasn't it? The don't you think and the wasn't it are tag questions. There's no need for those. Why can't you just say that was fun? When you use a tag question, it comes across as if you are not confident in your own opinion. As the source of a persuasive message, you want to communicate that you are confident in your own opinion. You don't have to check it with anybody else. That's key to do or not to do if you're the source of a persuasive message. I want to talk a little bit about language choices too in the context of a persuasive message. Language intensity in particular. There are things like opinionated language that can matter too, but here I'm going to focus on intensity. Here's the definition here. Language intensity includes metaphors. Life is like a box of chocolates. Any strong, vivid language that really makes your audience call images to mind. I mean, you could say, someone committed suicide, not in no intense language there, although suicide actually is an emotion laden word, so maybe that is somewhat intense language. Or you could say that person committed suicide by blowing his brains out. That is vivid language. That calls to mind a particular graphic image that would certainly be associated with high language intensity. Any emotionally charged word, suicide again is actually emotionally charged word, death, suffering, your book gives some examples. Those are emotionally charged words. And actually cursing or obscenities. Don't think that your book mentions this, but those are certainly a form of intense language as well. Like narratives, in terms of message content, Language intensity relies on pathos. This is a pathetic appeal, not a logical appeal, not a logos appeal. This calls on others' emotions, it calls on their imagination, it calls on their values, it calls on their sympathy. You're trying to create an image in their head, and you want them to react to that image. That's what you want. That's what you're trying to do with language intensity. Language intensity is, of all the things that we have talked about today, to me, it is the iffiest. It is the one that you may not want to necessarily use, no matter how credible a source you are, no matter what other factors you have working in your favor. Certainly, you should think that you will be perceived as a credible source if you want to use any form of intense language. Further, the use of that intense language should be perceived as appropriate to the situation or the topic. And who needs to see that as appropriate? The audience, whoever you're speaking to. Some instances, it's not appropriate to curse, for example, or it will be perceived by your audience as not appropriate to curse. Those are then not times to do that. It won't go over well for you. Another gender difference here, again, that I hate to talk about. I hate that it's true, I guess, but we see a lot of research with this, particularly with obscenities or cursing. Female sources of a persuasive message should probably always stay away from that. In virtually every study we've ever done with this, it is a credibility killer for women sources. It doesn't necessarily help men either, note that, but men can get away with the use of obscene language to a higher degree than women can, at least from the research that we have. So know that and be careful of that. However, intense language can work to persuade the audience if your target isn't already too committed to his or her own stance. Your book calls this being too ego involved. If they haven't already decided definitively how they feel, it could work. It's not going to work for you, though, like message evidence or even narratives or framing or source credibility. All those things might work. So it's certainly not where it's at, but it's one of the things that might matter. Again, these are just a few of the highlights that are covered in Chapter 9 of your book. There are a whole lot more pieces of information there that you should read, but I wanted to make sure to go over these with you.